In response to the need to have content-specific training for the fine arts, the Department of Education saw the need to hire staff members to represent the three largest fine arts content areas in Georgia. As a result, this is the fine arts team at the Georgia Department of Education. Jessica Booth, our fine arts program manager, has a background in the visual and media arts. Paul McLean is a fine arts program specialist who has a background in theater and film. And I'm Casey Hall, a fine arts program specialist who has a background in music. As a team, our main goal is to support fine arts teachers from across the state of Georgia by providing relevant and informative, content-specific professional development opportunities, high-quality instructional resources for the fine arts, and opportunities for collaboration and connection amongst fine arts teachers from all over the state. Hey everyone, and welcome to Behavior Basics, De-Escalation Strategies for Fine Arts Educators. Again, my name is Casey Hall, and I'm excited that you're here with us today. The purpose of this webinar is to provide you with some proactive efforts in developing strong behavior management strategies for behavior situations that may arise in your own fine arts classrooms. The strategies within this webinar are universal, so though I'm speaking to you today from a music educator's perspective, remember the strategies in which you're about to learn can be applied to any behavior situation in any fine arts content area. So with that being said, let's get started. Here's a brief overview of this webinar. First, we'll talk about my own experience with this topic, as well as accurately defining what de-escalation is and when these strategies should be used in your own music classrooms. Then we'll talk about communication and how it's not just what we say, but it's how we say what we say that's important in behavior situations that require de-escalation. Afterwards, we'll discuss some de-escalation tactics and strategies that you can use to de-escalate potential behavior situations from escalating in your own music classrooms, as well as an excellent communication model to follow. And lastly, we'll close with a brief feedback survey and my contact information should you need to reach me about this topic further after this webinar. There has probably been at some point in our careers as music teachers where a student seemingly has a complete meltdown in our classrooms of some sort or some fashion, and it completely derails not only our teaching, but also our students' learning. I know that for me, I've probably run the gamut of different behavior situations that are not always ideal, from a student throwing a temper tantrum to a student throwing chairs across the classroom. I've seen a lot, and I'm sure you have too. Now, these things didn't happen all the time, but when they did, it erupted my classroom into complete chaos, and I felt like my classroom was spiraling out of control, and I honestly was drowning in all of it. And so in order to protect my own sanity, I sought out help. I decided to attend a professional development session on de-escalation strategies, as you're taking one right now. And this was specifically for a classroom setting, and I learned what I learned in that session really honestly heavily influenced how I responded when attempting to manage behaviors in my classroom of a student that's in crisis or kind of in like a crisis mode situation. And so not only did these strategies aid in de-escalating that student or that situation or that crisis situation, but they're also, I felt, highly applicable to many situations that may arise in your own music classrooms. So I want to point out that I am in no way a behavior management expert or specialist, and I'm not an expert in de-escalation strategies. However, the strategies that I did learn, I found so helpful in my classroom, and I wanted to share them with you today. So for the exact definition of de-escalation, it is when you are trying to reduce or decrease the intensity of a difficult or dangerous situation. And now when we're talking about dangerous, we're talking about basically a student in crisis, a student who has they are having that meltdown, and how do we de-escalate that student's crisis mode to a more calm, more safe intensity. That's basically what de-escalation is in a nutshell. And when we want to use those strategies is hopefully before a student is in a crisis mode or before there's some sort of crisis instrument. I said before, I once had a student, or multiple times, throw a chair in my classroom. That would be one, a dangerous situation, right? And two, kind of a crisis situation. That's when you would start kind of or not start, that's when you would start applying these de-escalation strategies to that situation in particular, right? And then also, you might want to consider using some de-escalation strategies when a student begins to get upset, because as a student gets upset and things continue to happen more and more, they're escalating that kind of crisis level in your classroom. And if you're using these strategies, it's kind of a proactive way to de-escalate before they actually reach that crisis point in your classroom. So that's kind of the basic definition of de-escalation and how we want to, or when you be using them in your music classrooms. One of the most powerful things that we can use as a de-escalation strategy in our classrooms is just being aware of how we are actually communicating to our students. Because if we're honest, and maybe this has happened to you, sometimes things can get heated in a behavior crisis situation. You're trying to handle it, but you're also losing your cool and you're getting frustrated, and you may say things you don't mean or unintentionally make things worse by how we are actually communicating it. So remember that it's not just what we're saying to our students, but it's actually how we're saying it to them that can, either de-escalate a situation or add to the situation and increase the crisis level that we have kind of been talking about. So here are some basic communication tips that may help in a behavior crisis situation. Some of these you may already use or already know about. Some of them you maybe haven't considered before as a communication strategy. And some of these might be new to you. So really, take some time to reflect on these and think about which, of these tips or tactics or strategies would work for each unique situation that may come up in your music classroom, because one situation may require a certain communication tip, whereas other ones may not. So just kind of depends on each unique situation in your own classrooms. But I did want to go over a couple of these. I'm not going to go over all of them on the screen due to time, but a lot of the times when we get frustrated or we get angry, what do our voices do? Our voices naturally rise. So think about regulating the volume and remaining calm, using an unemotional tone, or at least trying to in that situation, because really you are the leader there. And so the students are going to kind of feed off of how you are responding and how you are communicating. And we don't want that kind of power struggle feel of, okay, well, they raise their voice, so I'm going to raise my voice. The teacher raised their voice again, so I'm going to raise my voice even higher. And it becomes this kind of more escalated thing that we don't want. So really think about regulating your volume and using a non-emotional tone. A big thing with students in particular is avoiding sarcasm. Students, for the most part, don't understand sarcasm as we would like them. As adults, sarcasm, we kind of understand the social cues of what sarcasm is, but for students, it's a little bit different, and it's a little bit harder for them to understand. So across the board, just really avoid sarcasm when you're talking to students, if all possible. And then be specific about exactly what you want them to do. Don't, and I mean that in as specific as possible. The broad things, I want you to sit down. Okay, well, a student could take that very broadly and say, sit down. They could sit down on the piano. They could sit down on an instrument. They could sit down on the floor. They could sit down upside down. There's so many things that you could do when you're asking a student nicely, as using an unemotional tone, using regulating volume, but then you say sit down. That could mean so many different things to a student in a high crisis environment. So be specific. I want you to sit down in your chair. That kind of thing. More specific than you think you need to be, probably. Another big one for me that I noticed, that I wasn't allowing my students time to actually process what I was asking them to do. I just expected them to do it and do it immediately. And sometimes it just takes time for the students, because they're in such a highly emotional state, to actually comprehend and process the things that you're saying. And that might take a little bit of time. So if they don't sit down immediately in the scenario I'm talking about right now, they may sit down in a couple of minutes, or once they kind of have that time to process or kind of chill out for a little bit. A big thing in regards to rules or expectations, or really just in general when you're communicating with a student, there's a big difference between a start request and a stop request. You may have heard this in other forms or fashions, But really, what a start request is like the opposite of a stop request, clearly. So avoid stating what not to do, but instead state what you want them to do. As an example, I have one up here on the screen is please walk as opposed to don't run. Kind of don't use those do not statements. Do not talk when I'm talking. Do not run in the hallway. Do not, just kind of flip it, and the change of perspective in a more positive way can really change how you're communicating with your students and how that communication is perceived from the level of a student. I'm sure we all remember when we were kids having a teacher point a finger and say, don't do this, don't do that. Probably didn't make us feel very good, or, made us even more angry when they said things like that. So flip the switch and say, and use those start requests, please walk, or please be quiet, or please, listen carefully as I'm speaking. That would be, a thing, say, don't talk while I'm teaching or something like that, a start request. So think about that, and that can be even applied to your rules and procedures in your classroom, kind of that whole switching the model of, or switching the perspective, I should say, of using a start request as opposed to a stop request. And then there's a couple more that you see on the screen. And one of the biggest ones, I put that one last because I think it's really important, is just don't forget to listen. Communication, as the saying goes, is a two-way street. And if the students are supposed to respect you enough to listen to what you should say, you need to respect them too, and their feelings and like their emotional state, and listen to that. So one of the biggest things to do is also don't forget to listen to what your students are telling you, whether that is communicating verbally or whether that is they're doing something non-verbally, and we'll talk about that later, that may cue you into what's actually happening to them in that crisis situation. Now we're going to talk about de-escalation tactics themselves. Some of these tactics might seem like no-brainers when you're kind of outside of a behavior crisis situation, like, duh, that makes complete sense. Obviously, you should do that. But in the heat of an actual behavior crisis moment, you may not initially think of these. So just kind of take some time as kind of going over some of these, and as you're reading them yourself, to just reflect on things that you naturally feel like you do, and things that you maybe need to work on and practice as you are handling these situations. And so I'm going to talk about some of the do's and the don'ts of when using these de-escalation strategies in an actual behavior crisis situation. So like I was saying earlier, the first one on the do side, something that you should always do, and I listed it first, just like I listed it last on the last slide, is to listen. I feel that is so important. I know once I kind of realized that I wasn't actually listening to my students, the game really changed for me, because I was giving them the time of day to express, whether that was non-verbally or verbally. Listening doesn't always have to be your ears. Listening, I feel, can also be with your eyes, that kind of non-verbal communication part of it, where I'm understanding what's happening, even though I'm not listening to what they're doing because they're not speaking. So that whole aspect of listening, I think, is so important, and giving students a time of day. Sometimes it would just be as simple as pulling a student to the side, saying, you know what, you're not in trouble. I just want to understand what's happening, and let them talk. That to me is such a powerful thing that I feel like is not used enough in classrooms in general, of actually listening to what students are experiencing, what they're feeling, what is causing them to react in a certain way. Part of that, and kind of after that listening aspect, if you give them time to say their piece about what is going on, really try to motivate the student. And when I'm saying that, not motivate the student to continue down that path, but motivate the student in a way that would make them have a more broad understanding of what they're experiencing, and almost like validate kind of what they're experiencing, things like. And that kind of goes to the next point of empathizing with the student. Empathizing is all about being able to kind of place yourself in another person's shoes and say, I know exactly how that feels. It must feel really bad, or must feel really make you feel really upset. Like I've had situations that happen to me and kind of feel how they feel and have conversations like that. Another one that is also, I think, highly effective is giving controlled choice. Now, controlled choice is obviously directed by the teacher. The student is not, controlling which choice. Or sorry, let me say that again. The student is not determining the choices. The teacher is determining the choice, and that's how it is controlled. So a lot of the times when I would have students either starting to get upset or they were already in crisis mode, I would give them options. Um, an example could be, okay, I see that you are wanting to hit the chair constantly and it's very distracting. You can either stop that and do it on a drum as we're playing a song, or you can continue doing it on the chair inappropriately during class and, you know, potentially continue down that path and get in trouble, as an example. Given that they can either play, hit on something that would be actually musical, or they could potentially get in trouble. And almost every single time they choose the other option that doesn't involve get them in trouble. Now, I'm not going to say that that's going to happen all the time in your situation, but for the most part, I noticed a really big change in how my students responded to me trying to de-escalate because I was giving them that freedom of choice. Even though it was controlled, I was controlling the choice. You might have, a student who is particularly talkative and really won't stop talking. We'll give them a choice. You can either continue to talk while I'm teaching and potentially get in trouble. I had to call your parent. There's consequences for that. Or you could stop right now and I could give the whole class 5 minutes at the end of class to talk. And that might be the choice they want because it's not going to get them in trouble, but they still get that time to talk in your classroom, for instance. Just another example. Completely change the subject. If there is something that's going on and you're trying to de-escalate and maybe not the whole class is kind of noticing, change the subject, switch gears. And really kind of almost like redirecting the conversation. Maybe there's a student who is bothering another student and that student's getting really upset about it. Maybe changing the subject, switching to a different activity that separates those two students where, the situation won't escalate. Remember, we're trying here to not make things escalate further. We're trying to de-escalate using some of these tactics. Again, like I was saying earlier, using humor sparingly, sarcasm, students, especially young children, really don't respond to sarcasm because they believe it to be true. And even though sarcasm is, we often use it to lighten the mood, but sometimes they just don't understand it and it confuses. It can be very confusing. So when you're using humor, don't use humor as sarcasm. Maybe make a funny joke about yourself or a funny joke about something, but not sarcasm towards the student or towards the situation. And then another big thing is that you should do is really think about resetting. Once the situation happens, we're resetting, we're good, and we're moving on. We're not going to continually go back to that over and over, that situation again. You might have to remind them, but we're not going to go back to that situation in particular, if that makes sense. Hey, remember when we did this? We're not going to do that. Let's continue and let's move on and move forward so that that doesn't happen again, right? And so kind of on the flip side of this, I don't want to belabor the point too much because you can read it on your screen, obviously. But things like kind of what we were talking about earlier of don't raising your voice, regulating your volume, so don't raise your voice. That can result in power struggles. Don't make threats or promises you can't keep, that automatically promotes a defensive behavior. Well, I'm going to call your mom. That promotes a defensive behavior for me. If someone call my mom, I'd be like, why do they call my mama? So think about that. Like when you're in the heat of the moment, don't make threats to students because it will almost always promote some sort of defensive behavior that will cause the situation to escalate further. The last one, it kind of ties again to the last one on the do side, is don't bring up past infractions, altercations, behaviors. And that applies to not only after the situation, after you've kind of reset, I think that also applies to the future going forward. A lot of the times when you see a student the next day, they may be like, ooh, is that teacher going to be mad at me again? You need to really kind of every day have a blank slate in regards to students when they are having these crisis modes. And every day when you see a student, it's, hey, Johnny, glad to see you today. And not in a sarcastic way like that kind of sounded. I was just trying to make an example and decide a student name. But actually have that blank slate, clean slate every time, and don't bring up the past infractions because that might set them off again, and you don't know that for certain. So next, what we're going to talk about is actually how to effectively and positively de-escalate situations. In order to have an effective de-escalation, like you're de-escalating a situation, for instance, when you're verbally de-escalating a student, you really want to have as many clear lines of communication as possible. Remember, communication is not just verbal, it can also be nonverbal. So think about those lines of communication as well. And just like, the old adage has always been said is, communication is a two-way street. So you have to listen to each other in those situations and have no barriers. And when I mean barriers, I'm talking about things that keep the meaning of what is being said from what is being heard. You probably remember growing up and your parents said one thing, but you heard another thing. And that kind of dichotomy of what is being said versus what is being heard, that can be a heavy barrier to actually effectively de-escalating a situation. And we'll talk about some of those communication barriers in a minute. When we talk about positive de-escalation and putting those two things together, effective de-escalation and positive de-escalation, is using helpful statements such as just something simple like, I want to help you, because that really, when it comes down to it, our job as teachers is to help our students learn, is to help our students succeed, is to help our students be successful in the future. Part of that is to be able to manage their behaviors and their emotions and their situations. So just providing that information for them, because they might have forgotten, in those crisis situations, they might have forgotten that you're there to help them. So present that positively to them. I want to help you. What can we do together so that I can understand? That's kind of the second thing. Please tell me more. That kind of, again, that open line of communication. Tell me more so I can better understand how to help you. It might be that you're not the person that they trust to talk with. And I think that's something that we forget about sometimes, is that the trust hasn't been built yet between you and that student. So maybe you need to defer to a more trusted or a preferred adult that the student would rather talk to get more insight into what's happening. And again, put yourself on the student side of finding a solution to the problem. Again, I think that we as teachers, we want to control so much and we want to make things easy for everyone in this situation, but how much more powerful would this situation be de-escalated if the solution was actually coming from the student themselves? I think that is probably the highest level of de-escalation you can have, because you're trying to aid the student and guide them and support them into finding a solution to what is causing them to go into crisis mode or to have a crisis level that is higher than it needs to be. And so with those two together, that effective communication and the positive communication that you're presenting to them can really effectively and positively de-escalate a situation. But I want to take a minute to talk about those communication barriers that can happen as you're talking, where you're not really understanding. You're listening to what was being said, but what you heard was something else. So let's take a look at those now. So here are some of those communication barriers that we were just talking about. Things like prejudging a student based on a situation, that you come in contact with a student, or criticizing them for doing something, arguing. You're not actively listening to what they're saying. You're engaging in a power struggle. You are threatening them. There's name calling. You're minimizing their feelings, their emotions, you're minimizing the situation itself, and you're arguing with them. All these are communication barriers where when you're trying to de-escalate a situation, you're not effectively able to do so because those barriers are in place. You can probably reflect on yourself in situations where you've had some crisis level behaviors in your own self as an adult, and it's because of arguing. It's because of someone's telling you to do something. It's because someone has prejudged the situation without actually listening to the people that are in the situation itself, or they're not actively listening. They're not really listening to what you're saying, or they're minimizing the situation. Oh, it's really not that big of a deal, but to you it is. And so those barriers prevent that effective and positive communication from happening. So in the next couple of slides, I have some listening skills that I think are really great when we're actively trying to effectively and positively de-escalate a situation. So let's take a look at those.